More details have emerged about the Assassin's Creed Black Flag remake, and it's causing a hell of an uproar online, specifically and obviously between the two wings of the Assassin's Creed fandom. Either you're a fan of the old school Assassin's Creed games, which come with a hell of a lot of more, I don't know, martial arts choreography and more motion captured moves, or whatever you want to call that old style of combat, or you like the new age stuff, the more RPG progression, the more flaily combat, or again, whatever you would call it from Origins onwards, because now that we know more information about the Assassin's Creed Black Flag remake from the Video magazine, which is a French outlet over on YouTube. One of the biggest changes is overhauling the combat system and also removing the modern day segments from Black Flag. There's more stuff to break down, but I'll read down the specifics. Now, again, like I said, this comes from a French outlet. It's also been translated on Twitter by a fan account called The Hidden One, but everyone's massively in an uproar over this because depending on which side you come down, either this is great or it's maybe the worst thing that could possibly happen to a Black Flag remake. So to get specific, we will have loot and gear stats for Edward Kenway, inventory systems, and combat leaning towards the RPG style rather than the choreographed combat of the original game. The second big thing, like I said, is removing the modern day segments and replacing them with more content from Edward's pirate era. Now, it's mentioned that part of this is restoring cut content from the original that didn't make it through, and specifically Mary Reed's story is mentioned. I don't even remember that thing from like 12 years ago, but it seems like the rest of that or all of that or whatever is being put in the game. But obviously removing the modern day segments is a massive talking point. It's funny because I'm old enough and have been with Assassin's Creed since the beginning that I remember the conversations around people wishing the modern day segments would be removed. I always loved that futuristic stuff. I always thought it gave Assassin's Creed a lot more of a unique identity. And, you know, as someone who loves stupid sci-fi BS like Lost or whatever it is, I always thought it was quite fun trying to unpick what was happening in the modern day. However, it is worth saying that Black Flag and those modern day segments, that was the first game that hyper extended the logical closure point of that storyline. Black Flag was the first game developed from the beginning without the series creator. Patrice Désilets left just before Assassin's Creed 3. And if you play AC3, you know the way that game ends, which is a very definitive endpoint. And then it was on Ubisoft to try and think of various ways that they could pull the story forward. And that meant, I guess, spoilers for Black Flag, depending on what they're going to amend or change, having to literally go in and analyze and do an autopsy on the corpse of Desmond from the end of AC3 to try and pull apart different things that he meant in regards to the Hidden Ones, and those who came before and whatever the hell you want to call the Isu. Like none of this will make any sense if you never followed a lot of the modern day stuff anyway. And even in Black Flag, it felt like Ubisoft were just admitting they had no idea where they could possibly take the story, because a lot of the modern day segments, all of the modern day segments then started taking place in first person, where they decided to break the fourth wall and they had you playing as a game tester working for Abstergo in partnership with Ubisoft, and they then made it so that all the Assassin's Creed games existed within the Assassin's Creed games. And so when you were walking around the literal in-game dev offices, you were going to the different terminals as people were making like Assassin's Creed Rogue or whatever it was. They showed different characters, like Avalon Grand Prix was in there, and it was just, at the time it was kind of fun because it was like, okay, this kind of feels like an authored take, like this feels like a potential new lease on life for the series or whatever. It felt like they maybe had ideas they wanted to reveal in time. And obviously, as we realized, that just wasn't the case. And Assassin's Creed only would really bottom out in regards to the modern day stuff. They would ditch it entirely in a couple of different games, only to then try and bring it back in the most forced way possible. Then we got all this stuff, like the most modern day stuff, not to do modern day game spoilers, but the way that things have gone in Valhalla and then Valhalla's DLC and where we're at now. And the role that Desmond has now is so far removed from what was assumedly like a 3-game plan back in the day. Voice actor Nolan North, who voiced Desmond, literally said that as far as he knew, there was only meant to be this standard handful of games. Like, you were meant to have Desmond, he would learn all the tricks and trades of being an assassin through the bleeding effect, controlling Altair from the first game, then Ezio, and then Connor in the third game. He would then become an assassin and do all the modern day assassin stuff, and that was it. That was how it was meant to go. And you can see that play out in bits and pieces across the trilogy, but at some point the franchise made way too much money and they needed to discontinue it. So to bring it back to the Black Flag remake, it is one of the most beloved entries in the series, but not necessarily because of the modern day stuff. And I guess that's why Ubisoft have gone, we don't want to do this again. Like, those segments, that addressing of just how kind of lost they were in the writer's room and they just sort of steered into it, isn't something that they want to replicate. So that's one of the major things that's being changed, is just gutting that stuff out of the game. And the other thing, the RPG combat, again, it depends where you fall. I love old school Assassin's Creed combat. I like the whole, like dancing around enemies, having fun with the choreography, especially in AC2 and Brotherhood, like being able to disarm enemies and then kill them with their own gear, or launching a spear from one dude onto the guy that's coming at you on a horse. I love all that stuff. You can do bits and pieces of that combat in the new games, but to me, it never felt as, I don't know, proficient as those old games. It always felt like I was doing more of like a Matrix fight in those original titles. And ever since The Witcher 3 blew up, that very much is the template that, Ubisoft started to chase. In terms of other things from the leak, it's mentioned that the Black Flag map is not any bigger, but the islands will be filled with more activities and side content. The leaker mentions that it's not the same big budget remake level as Resident Evil 2 or Silent Hill 2, but more of a faithful reimagining with updates. It is hard to do a faithful reimagining with a handful of updates when you're gutting half the story and you're overhauling the combat, but this is a leak. This is a thing that is ongoing. We're yet to have official confirmation or denial from Ubisoft, but usually when something this big happens, it then falls on the studio themselves to get out there and say, this is what we're actually doing. So here's hoping that by just raising the level of conversation around this, we'll get some clarification. For additional things though, Ubisoft are using the Anvil pipeline engine. That's the same as Assassin's Creed Shadow, so at least it's going to look absolutely gorgeous. It's currently targeted for an early 2026 release date. The leaker thinks that it's going to be in March. Some other sources think it might slip later into 2026. And the last thing, which is really, really interesting, is that Ubisoft are reusing assets from Skull and Bones, which, I have to imagine that there's a bit of a crossover there in the first place. It always felt like Skull and Bones was the extension of the multiplayer mode. Sorry, the side mode that was first in Assassin's Creed 3 and was then focused on for Black Flag. And then it was like, okay, what are you guys going to do with this? And then they span it off into a whole separate thing, which became Skull and Bones. And then occasionally you get ship combat, like an Origin ship combat is pretty fun. But I feel like they never really knew what to do with this. And then it became Skull and Bones, even though that thing was in development for a lifelong amount of time. And so it is kind of interesting thinking that on a long enough timeline, one game became the other one, and then it kind of goes back again. The leak mentions that the average player shouldn't be able to tell in terms of what's been reused or whatever. But it is interesting just thinking of the timeline of the series, the side projects, and the things that the naval combat led to. When it was first in Assassin's Creed 3, I couldn't believe that was a mode. It felt like the weirdest thing to put into that game. And I think a lot of people didn't even bother enjoying or getting stuck into that combat in AC3. It was Black Flag that really put it on the map. So overall, this is one of those titles that has been rumored for a good long while. Ubisoft feel like they could do with a bit of a win. They are forever starved of goodwill, and they've had a lot of failed projects across the last few years. My beloved Star Wars Outlaws being one of them. That game is way better than people think it is. And same with Prince of Persia Lost Crown. They put out, every now and then, solid enough video games. It's just that their general reputation is so mired in, getting as much money out of you as possible for the same identical game formulas over and over and over again. And it's not like the likes of Outlaws and Lost Crown. It's not like they're not very Disneyfied and they're aiming for that massive wide audience with the most, bottom level dialogue possible. And so I get why those things are massively off-putting. It's just Ubisoft are in such a fascinating position, and the more stuff that leaks about them, you've got that Insider Gaming report about everything that they've got planned, from a Rayman remake to Far Cry 7 to Assassin's Creed remake and all the other Assassin's Creeds that are in production, like AC Hex or whatever. It feels like they're sort of scrabbling to make things work. It's not like they're on those wider conversations about the studio potentially being sold off just due to how rocky their recent sales have been. So we'll keep fingers crossed. Hopefully, all the right moves are being made. Hopefully they do right by the fans. But the fact that they have a bit of a fractured fan base anyway in regards to which flavor of Assassin's Creed you prefer might put them in a bit of an unwinnable situation.